MSDs in occupational health. And so his positions include Director of Health and Safety Policy Branch, policy being critical in its moving ahead, and Director of Occupational Health and Safety Branch in the Operations Division. And he also serves as chair on the Canadian Standards Association Strategic Steering Committee on Occupational Health and Safety. So he comes well recommended. And his colleague, Peter Goyert, is a Canadian certified professional ergonomist with over 20 years of experience. He's worked with industry, labor, and he's been part of a tripartite process resulting in the formal publication of the BC ergonomic regulations, known as the ergonomic MSI requirements. So he's very familiar with the challenges and successes that BC have had. And so his primary work is with employers, assisting them to examine their ergonomic issues through a three-tiered approach. And I think this comes back to one of the questions of consultation, education, and enforcement. And I think we're going to think about those pillars a lot as we move forwards. And Peter teaches ergonomics at the university level and is a clinical assistant professor at the School of Physiotherapy and the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. And so I'd like to welcome colleagues from British Columbia to hear about their moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks to you and to Desiree for the kind invitation to come and talk about BC here today. I must say it still feels a little bit odd to be representing British Columbia to an Ontario audience. The other way around would probably feel a lot more comfortable, but nonetheless, we're here. I brought Peter with me because he's the true expert on this team. And he will answer all the difficult questions. What we're going to do is focus a little bit on the BC ergonomics regulation, quickly talk a bit about the development and what the essential requirements of the reg are. Then Peter's going to take over and talk about experience since the regulation went into effect, how it's being applied, some of the success stories and the continuing challenges, and some of the resources that have been developed along the way. And he's going to try to anticipate some of your questions and answer them before you get to ask them. He's got a frequently asked questions component towards the end. Another point to keep in mind is that the regulation and much of what has happened in British Columbia is not specific to manual material handling. It applies to generally to ergonomics as we know it, and that's going to be something just to keep in mind as we go through some of the material today. A very brief history. People will remember, those of us who've been in the business for a long time will remember the 90s as a particular era of focus on ergonomics and ergonomic regulations particularly. BC initiated an overall review of their health and safety regulations in 1992 and decided, because of the number of MSDs being experienced, to include an ergonomics as a potential new regulation, and a subgroup of the overall process was set up to look at that and to develop some proposals. The regulation went into effect in 1998. Gap of some 6 years, taking full effect the following year. Now, I'm not going to go into what happened between 1992 and 1998 because I largely agree with von Bismarck that, and this is from personal experience, I've worked in 2 sausage factories in my life and I've worked in 2 policy divisions in my life. So. And I strongly agree with what he says here. There's a lot that happens there that's in both places that can be very upsetting at the time and even nauseating, believe me. Anyway, let's move on. It is safe to say that it was a very controversial period. The media became involved, which is quite unusual, the extent to which the media were involved in commenting on what was happening. Some rather dramatic headlines in newspapers. Radio talk shows were picking up on the idea, despite the fact they could barely pronounce the word ergonomics and much less musculoskeletal. But nonetheless, it proved to be a difficult time, and it's best left to the history books. There was one point I'll make about the period, and that is when the regulation was the first draft that was proposed by the working group, the subcommittee, did contain a reference to a code of practice, and there was a lengthy and detailed code of practice developed to go with the regulation. And I'll just read you, it said, compliance with the ergonomics regulations must be achieved through the application of the ergonomics code of practice published by the board, or an alternative method that provides an equal or higher level of protection for worker health and safety. So I think the feeling was that this was essentially making the code of practice part of the regulation. People were very concerned that they would be required to follow the very prescriptive and detailed procedures in the code, and this created one of the biggest issues around the regulation. Took a long time, and ultimately that section was withdrawn, and the code was not seen as part of the regulation from then on. So the regulation itself, just fairly quickly, it applies to all provincially regulated workplaces in BC. It is a performance-based regulation, and it does focus on the emphasis on sprains, strains, and overexertion, the things we think of in terms of ergonomics. This chart shows sort of the framework for the regulation, and I'll take you very quickly through some of the language involved because it does influence how the thing is applied. The regulation says that risk identification, the employer must identify factors in the workplace that may expose workers to a risk of MSI. And then it sets out a list of factors which must be considered, and I'll read the list to you in a minute. Risk control, the employer must eliminate, or if this is not practicable, minimize the risk of MSIs to workers. Personal protective equipment may only be used where engineering or administrative controls are not practicable, and the employer must implement interim control measures when the introduction of permanent control measures will be delayed. There is a requirement for education and training. The employer must ensure that workers are educated in risk identification, including the recognition of early signs and symptoms and potential health effects. And the employer must ensure that workers are trained in the use of any required measures, including work procedures, mechanical aids, and personal protective equipment. There's also a requirement for evaluation. The employer must monitor the effectiveness of the measures taken to comply with the regulation and ensure that they are reviewed at least annually. And when the monitoring identifies deficiencies, they must be corrected without undue delay. And the final feature of the regulation is a fairly strong requirement for consultation. The employer must consult with the Joint Committee or the worker health and safety representatives with respect to the following: A, risk identification, assessment, and control; B, the content and provision of worker education and training; and C, the evaluation of the compliance measures taken. The employer must also, when performing a risk assessment, consult with workers with signs or symptoms of MSIs and a representative sample of the workers who are required to carry out the work being assessed. So fairly detailed requirements for consultation. Now the risk factors I mentioned, there are 5 groups of risk factors. Physical demands includes things like force, repetition, duration, posture, and local contact stress. The layout and condition of the workplace includes things like working reaches, heights, seating, and floor surfaces. The characteristics of objects being handled include size and shape, load condition and weight distribution, and container, tool, and equipment handles. Environmental conditions, including cold temperature, and the organization of work, including work recovery cycles, task variability, and work rate. So these are all things that must be considered in risk assessment. So the regulation was based on compromise, as I said at the time, a lot of difficult issues, a lot of discussion. It is performance-based, but the risk factors to be considered are listed. And as Peter will elaborate on a little bit, it can be a challenge to enforce, as there are no specific published limits to go along with it. I think it's fair to say, in sort of a quick overview, that the regulation has definitely raised the awareness of the MSI issue in BC. I think if there was a good side to the development process, it was the amount of publicity. There's no such thing as bad publicity in a sense, so that it did raise awareness even then. It has made employers realize that this is something they need to deal with, and it does give WorkSafeBC some tools to enforce compliance. But it is still controversial in many ways even today, and we have learned a lot. I'm going to turn it over at this point to Peter, and he's going to take you through some of the things that have happened since the regulation went into effect.
Thank you, Ed. I was away on vacation for the week prior to this, and Ed promised me no surprises. He wouldn't change the order of my slides, so last night he reiterated that. How do we deal with the application of the regulation? From a corporate perspective, the WorkSafeBC looks at basically high-risk industry groups. We don't really walk down one side of the street and up the other looking for ergonomic violations. We deal with specific industry groups. And really, we're trying to create a little bit more awareness through education and consultation, and through some other things that we'll talk about in a minute. This year, there's been a lot of extra focus on heavy manufacturing from an ergonomics point of view, simply because we don't have the resources to spread ourselves around. On a regional basis, the province is divided into 6 or 7 regions. And the officers there, the inspection officers, will be looking at sort of the high-risk employers. They'll all have a list that they have to visit. And the other thing that we deal with is response work. If we get a phone call from the public, if we get a phone call from the union, we have to respond. So a lot of times the response tends to be office ergonomics, things like that, but we have to deal with those as well. So that's what happens on a regional level. Which one do I press here? This one here? Yeah. Okay, so what are the high-risk employers? Essentially, we've divided them, or WorkSafeBC has divided them into 4. It's manufacturing, particularly heavy manufacturing, where we focus our activities. This year and last year, basically steel fabrication, structural steel fabrication, and foundries has been sort of, people are, shall we say, areas of interest for us. In healthcare, which we're not going to really talk about today, but healthcare is a huge, complicated issue for us. And what we've decided to do is, instead of sending our officers in there to just do general lookabouts, and a lot of officers don't really enjoy doing this, but it's basically point-of-care inspections. Go to where the patients are being lifted. Don't go to the laundry. Don't go to the furnace room. Go to where the patients are being lifted. And that way we're able to sort of focus on the patient handling. Construction is a very big one where we're having some challenges, and we tend to look at that more in terms of what resources can we provide, and as well as forestry is another challenge for us, and we've basically narrowed that down, and we're focusing our efforts on the silviculture area. So we do have some successes. Basically, since the implementation of the regulation, certainly the MSI rates have come down quite significantly. We've developed a lot of officer field experience. Each inspection officer, when they come to the board and on an annual basis, they receive sort of 2 days of basic training, which has sort of over the years fluctuated from the basics of ergonomics, just how to go out and write an ergonomic order according to the regulation. And as Ed mentioned, there is a real basic increased awareness amongst employers and workers that the ergonomic regulations are there and that people need to comply with them. And the other successes we've had over the years, sort of numbers of ergonomists that have come and gone, from a high of 9 ergonomists to the province right now to sort of, we have 3 that deal with musculoskeletal injury prevention, and we act as a resource to the officers and to employers. I know it's tough to sort of look at a lot of statistics early in the morning, but if you take a look at the numbers in red, those are the only ones that are really of any interest to us. In 1997, all ergonomic claims were 22,460, and if you look down that list to 2009, we're down to about 16,000 ergonomic claims. Now, if you take a look at the next red column, what you'll see is the percentage of ergonomic claims to all other claims. And I noted that Ontario has about 40% of all the MSD claims. Ours are slightly lower. It hangs around about 1/3. So, in fact, you could say in 1970 or 1997, we were better off than we are today, certainly, in terms of it's still about 33%. One of the things you'll also notice in the second column, the third red column, is really the sort of the short duration paid, and we've sort of gone from, I actually can't see that, from about 33% up to 36%. So while the injury numbers are going down, the percentage of MSI claims in relation to that are actually going up. And the same happens for costs. So I've just sort of put that briefly into a graph, and what you'll see is as the numbers of claims go up and down or fluctuate over the decade, so do the number of ergonomic claims. So it's fairly consistent, and that's one of the sort of stubborn things that we haven't been able to drive down. If you look at the days lost, pretty much the same thing happens. As all the other claims go up and down, so do the ergonomic claims. And I think the last one that I just want to show you is the claims cost. And this is something we're struggling with as a sort of relationship to the ergonomic claims. Claims costs have gone up quite considerably. And we're not really sure why that is. We think it might be older workers. We think it might be the economy. We don't really have a good sense of why that is happening. So what are some of our continued challenges? As I mentioned, the duration of some of these claims are going up considerably. We all know that aging workers are a big sort of part of the problem in so much as they don't get hurt as frequently, but when they do, they're off for a lot longer. The other thing people always ask us is, how are you making out with the ergonomic regulations? It's very difficult to measure a cause and effect, and sometimes the trailing indicators such as injury rate is not perhaps the best way of doing that. One of the big issues we have with respect to our inspection officers is defining compliance with a performance-based regulation, and very difficult. We don't have a code of practice, which was unfortunately lost, and we do have economic factors in there. We have the aging workers, we have the young workers. All of these sorts of things have an impact and challenge us sort of on a regular basis. We do other things as well other than educate, consult, and enforce. We have some funded projects through which external health and safety agencies can get money. There was $6 million made available to the health authorities for ceiling lifts and electric beds. We have a lot of web-based tools that people can access. There's lots of ergonomic publications online. I don't know how many of you ever visited our website. There's quite a few things in there that we think are useful tools for employers and other people as well. And of course, you can get those things free online, or if you have extra money in your budget, you can always purchase them hard copy from our bookstore. A number of years ago, because they're performance-based regulations, people really didn't know sort of how much was too much, and we put together guidelines for the regulation. And it was a bit controversial at the time because the employer community thought that perhaps these guidelines were going to be a secret, sneaky way of us putting the code of practice back. So in effect, the guideline is just, it helps achieve consistency for inspection officers, and it certainly makes it easier for employers to understand what some of the terminology in the regulation means. And it doesn't really give us any, shall we say, levels of exposure. So it's not like the code of practice. We do have a lot of resources online. I just want to briefly show you some of these. They're all available on our website. Construction is an area where we tend not to make employers do much in the way of risk assessment. We tend to look for solutions. It's a very challenging industry to sort of get to be interested in ergonomics. They're there one day and they're gone the next. So if we can give them something quick and easy, that tends to be our approach. The manufacturing resources are varied and many. We have a lot of things. Basically what we do is we take some of the information in our risk assessment and risk identification sheets and just personalize it for the manufacturing industry. I think everybody likes all the different industries. They like to have stuff that relates to them. So essentially that's what we've done here. Healthcare resources, excuse me, is fairly comprehensive. One of the difficult things is the regulation was never intended to apply to patient handling, but yet we had to be very careful on how we do that, and we published a book called Handle with Care, how to apply the regulation to patient handling. So a number of resources available there. And I think the more we put out there, certainly the more people ask for, so we continue to deal with that. In terms of manufacturing, it's really a wide breadth of industries in that area, you know, all the way from making bread to making glass. So what we've done is we put together a sort of a brochure info flip type of thing that kind of covers everything from risk control to risk assessment to what the regulation requires. Again, it's tailored more or less to the industry rather than just the general sort of ergonomic guidelines. Frequently asked questions. So now, we knew some of this was going to come up. What type of risk assessment is acceptable to the board? We don't have a requirement that says the employer must use NIOSH, the employer must use RULA-REBA. We simply say the employer must assess the risk. And because it's performance-based, the employer can really do whatever they like. But what we have done is we have provided them with an online risk assessment, risk identification forms, which we, I guess for want of a better word, stole from Washington State at the time. And it allows the employer to get a rough idea of whether their risks are high, low, or medium. And we've changed these for online fillable PDF so that it makes it very easy for people to look at that. And although there's no requirement for the employer to use that, we tend to push that a little bit because the inspectors find it easy and it's easy for them to understand. So there is no specific requirement for the employer to use any type of risk assessment, but other than one that's acceptable to the board, which is always a good question. What kind of services do we offer? Well, our inspection officers are out there. They're educating, they're consulting, and I guess if you want to call it a service, they're enforcing the regulation in terms of what Ed talked about, the risk identification, risk assessment, and risk control. The ergonomists, the three of us, we do sort of make our way around the province as much as possible, looking at some of the high-risk areas to look and see if we can, typically we consult. I can write orders. I tend not to write orders because it's somebody else's jurisdiction, but when need be, we can do that. I think some of the officers are very shy about doing that sort of thing, so they would like to leave it up to me to do it. Sometimes I craft an order for them that they can do, and we'll talk about orders very shortly here. We're talking about specific manual material handling guidelines. We don't have them. We did have the code of practice, which was sort of roundly rejected by the employer group, but we basically use the guidelines, and because the regulation sort of covers more than just manual material handling, we've chosen at this point not to have some guidelines. There's plenty of guidelines out there, but so we don't really have them specific to manual handling. What's fast tracking? Fast tracking, you won't find that in our regulation, but if we find somewhere that there's a risk control available that's fast, easy, and practicable, we will tell the employer about it. Simple example, ceiling lifts. We don't really want health authorities to give us long risk assessments on what it's like to lift a patient. Is it high risk? Is it low risk? Is it medium risk? We already know what the answer is, so say, just if you put that into place, we'll consider that compliance. There are lots of ergonomic risk controls out there that we know that work. I'm not interested in having employers give me risk assessments that I'm going to have to do, so if they put it into place, we won't write the order. So what is the role of the inspector? The inspectors, they all receive 2 to 3 days of training, and there is some expectation of them that they go out there, identify the hazards, and sort of write the order if required. If it gets complicated, if it gets beyond their capacity, they can phone one of the 3 ergonomists and we'll come out and look at that for them. and help them out. But they are ultimately responsible for the list on their high-risk strategy. So what about enforcement? $1,000,000 question is, how many orders do you write every year? 2009, there were 190 orders written in the province, and in 2010, there were 188 orders written. So some of you may say, wow, that's a lot, and others may say, that's hardly any considering the numbers that you have. Those are the numbers that we have. There are other ways that officers deal with employers without writing orders. They can write an inspection report and reference the regulation, which means it's an easy way out for them because they don't have to follow up. And then the employer is actually told, it's kind of like a warning. Here we are discussing ergonomics. Next time I come in here, maybe I'll write an order. So basically, in the neighborhood of about 200 orders a year. Of course, the question that we always get is, have you seen any effect? All this work you're doing, is it driving the injury rate down? Well, what we've seen is the injury rate has been coming down, but as I mentioned earlier, so has the general injury rate. So what we see is as the injury rate sort of ebbs and flows, so does the MSI rate. Certainly has come down considerably since 1997, but so has the general injury rate. So is this a result of the regulation? We don't know. It's very difficult with trailing indicators to see that. One would ask the question, if only 200 orders a year have been written, is that something that's going to drive the injury rate down? I'll leave that for other people to decide. So in conclusion, what I really want to say is, yes, MSI risks are significant risk to workers. We know that because we have 33% of our injuries related to MSI. And really, the ergonomic regulation is just is an attempt to deal with these risks. You know, have we been totally successful? In some respects we have. In others, we're still facing a lot of challenges. And what it does through our risk assessment, risk identification, it actually sets a standard by which we look at these risks. Are they high? Are they medium? Are they low? You need to do something. So there's a lot of information on our website, which I'm sure some of you have already visited. And you know, we're here for the rest of the day. We can certainly answer any questions. We have lots of resources available on the website. Anything on the website is free to use. We certainly have developed a lot of tools that we have over the years. And I do have a couple of minutes for questions, I believe.
Erna Buena, Ontario Nurses Association. You mentioned that you have money available for funding, and we're working quite closely with several employers. And quite often we see a lot of injuries with old beds, the cranking of the beds, and not having enough ceiling lifts. So how do employers in BC access that money? Because now that we have a new prevention system, maybe that's something that our government needs to do, similar to what BC is doing.
When I say we have money for the employers, it's really they have their own money back. What happens is the assessment rate for those employers is upped a little bit to pay for these things. For instance, the $6 million ceiling lift project, that basically came out of the assessment rate for the health authorities, which was given back to them in terms of, you know, ceiling lifts or electric beds. There are other areas where the board does through small grants and initiatives where they give money back, but it wouldn't certainly be it's sort of less than $15,000. But the big money is in raising the assessment rate. So we can't just do that. We have to go to the employer and say, can we raise your assessment rate to do this? So in effect, we're one big insurance company, and we're giving them a rebate in terms of money for specific health and safety initiatives.
Are you still seeing a lot of the old beds then in healthcare, or have most of them replaced those beds?
I would love to say most of them have been replaced, but it probably isn't true. I think we still see that a lot of the old beds are still there. And this $6 million grant that was given was a sort of a one-shot deal, and it wasn't specified that they had to replace. They had to put it into health and safety controls, which we hoped would be, for the most part, ceiling lifts, floor lifts, and beds. But there was no expectation that everybody replaces the beds. And I think over time we're seeing a lot of replacement. The big health authorities, that's not a problem. Some of the smaller affiliate ones, just the care homes, they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, nor do they have access to the funding. So,
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Jeff Casey, OCal. Based on everything that you presented, I'm wondering if there's anything that you would change or add to your current process, and then also if you have any advice for what Ontario should do.
what would I change? That's a difficult question because I don't have another reference point. I always tell people, be very careful what you ask for because you might get it. Yesterday we talked to a lot of people and they have the same challenges that we have. We do have a specific regulation only in terms of what the employer must do. And, we're still facing pretty much the same challenges. I don't know that necessarily the compliance route is the best way to go. What I would make sure that you do, if the inspectors who go out there, they need to be fairly comfortable with this whole concept of sort of ergonomics, risk control, because otherwise, my favorite saying is if a safety officer is out there, he'd rather look for a ladder to write out a service than write ergonomic orders, simply because it's easy, quick, and he can get out of there. So my advice is to make sure that people are really sort of comfortable with the whole notion. And that's very difficult to do. I mean, we do train the officers, but if safety officer comes out of a sawmill with 20 years of safety experience in a sawmill, he's not going to be very comfortable going into a hospital or something that's out of his comfort zone. But that's sort of a high-level advice. I don't know if that's that helpful. It's still a challenge.
Ivan Schlepetis from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. The original code of practice, I think that it had the NIOSH lifting equation in it, and the web-based tool that you have is based on the Washington State lifting calculator. I was wondering if you could just briefly explain what was the rationale for going to that one as opposed to NIOSH.
I can. The NIOSH lifting equation was deemed to be fairly restrictive, and when we actually took the worksheets from Washington State, that was done for reasons of, well, shall I say, political expediency, because we simply took another jurisdiction's tool so that we wouldn't be criticized for making things up on the fly. And the lifting calculator is really just an electronic version of the Washington State lifting tool at the back. That's all it is. So that's really why we've taken that rather than the NIOSH lifting equation. We wanted it to be consistent. So in fact, the two tools that we have online, one is the push-pull carry calculator, which is an electronic version of Snook, and the lifting calculator is an electronic version of the lifting tool in the Washington State lifting assessment. There was no sort of ulterior motive. It's just we wanted to maintain some consistency. And again, recognizing that the employers don't have to use that. They can use NIOSH if they like. And that's how that came to be.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
John Vanderbilt, Ministry of Labor. Peter and Ed both, thank you very much for a very informative presentation, candid in your comments. Ed, I think, alluded to the initiation of the regulation as creating a lot of awareness about MSDs and ergonomics in general, and in terms of the regulation. But can you just comment on the additional or what efforts you put in at the front end and continue to have that awareness despite specific tools and calculators, raising the profile and the awareness, and what are some of the learnings that you'd have or recommend that are effective in raising the awareness aspect despite whether there's a regulation or a legal requirement?
We do have basically this whole thing with ergonomics that we found is that if we keep our foot on the gas, everybody's aware. As soon as you take your foot off the gas and focus on something else, the employers will focus on something else as well. So every couple of years what we do is we change the focus of our high-risk strategy. We'll deal with manufacturing and do a blitz on manufacturing, and then we'll change it to healthcare. We do have sort of media blitzes, not necessarily about the regulation, but generally around sort of back care awareness. We have a partnership with the BC Chiropractic Association where they have advertisements on lifting properly. I know that's not necessarily related to the regulation, but just to kind of keep it in the forefront. Those are things that we do. I can't offhand think of any of the other sort of media campaigns we do, but every 1 or 2 years there's a media campaign which also relates back to the sort of ergonomic regulations. It's very difficult to get public interested in sort of regulatory things, so we tend to make it lighthearted and just sort of to raise the awareness of musculoskeletal injuries. But it's a challenge. It's, you know, after a couple of years, people lose interest. And I could say each year with the inspecting officers, we bring them in, tell them what we need to do. Much like what happened in Ontario, there was a big blitz on ergonomics. But, you know, I don't know what your experience is, but as soon as you stop the blitz, as it were, everybody goes back and does what they've always done.